Have you ever wondered why so many people pray for blessings, yet few ever step fully into the life they were meant to live? Some wait for divine intervention as though it will fall from the sky, while others carry a quiet awareness that heaven never simply delivers. It responds to alignment. A woman's heart may cry out to God, yet her own mind, rooted in fear, wounded by betrayal, fractured by doubt, can block the very promise meant for her. The greatest prisons are not built of stone. They are forged from thoughts, from beliefs passed down through generations, from silent agreements made in moments of pain. Jung called it the shadow, those unclaimed fragments of the soul buried deep, controlling behavior from the darkness. When a woman does not see her own worth, she bends to fit the mold of what others demand. When she fears abandonment, she chases. When she doubts her calling, she shrinks herself to avoid the weight of responsibility. And yet, she prays for destiny. She prays for love. She prays for a promise she is not yet prepared to receive. God does not withhold blessings out of cruelty. The divine waits for the vessel to be ready. Seneca once said, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." In spiritual terms, promise manifests when the soul stops fighting against its own becoming. You cannot ask for a king while still living as if you are unworthy of a crown. You cannot cry out for peace while secretly feeding the chaos in your own heart. Some women wonder why their lives attract men who wound rather than men who protect. They ask why they pour out love yet receive so little in return. But if the unconscious is still ruled by fear, it will choose the familiar pain rather than the unfamiliar promise. The ego projects, drawing shadows that mirror its own unhealed places. The man you cannot let go of is often not a man at all, but a mirror, a reflection of your own inner bondage, showing you where you have yet to rise. What would happen if you stopped chasing approval, if you no longer let the opinions of others define your value? There is a power in becoming still, in listening to the voice of God within rather than the noise around you. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." If your mind is painted with fear, every opportunity will look like a threat. If it is painted with faith, every obstacle becomes a doorway. This is why so many never step into their promise. They pray for change without changing their inner life. The ancient Stoics knew this, just as Jung knew it. They spoke of self-mastery, of a mind disciplined enough to stand in truth, even when emotions rage. A woman aligned with her higher self stops negotiating with her worth. She no longer fears loss because she understands that what is meant for her cannot be taken, and what is taken was never truly meant. When you stop begging to be seen, you begin to see yourself. And when you see yourself clearly, you begin to understand how God sees you. Not as broken, but as becoming. Not as unworthy, but as chosen. The shift begins when you realize that divine promises are not simply handed to you, they are drawn to you when you embody them. Healing your shadow, integrating your pain, and standing in your value are acts of spiritual warfare. This is not passivity. This is preparation. Some women fear that if they stop proving their worth, love will abandon them. But true love does not need to be convinced. It recognizes what is rare And when you refuse to chase, you discover that what once ran from you now approaches in reverence. The man who sees your soul is not intimidated by your strength because he too has faced his shadow. The opportunities that once slipped through your fingers now remain because your spirit is ready to hold them. So ask yourself, what promise have you been praying for? And are you becoming the woman who can carry it? God will not send a blessing you will sabotage. He waits for your mindset to shift, for your spirit to say, I will no longer betray myself to be loved. I will no longer silence my own voice to be accepted. I will no longer live in fear of losing what was never mine. When that transformation takes root, heaven moves. The divine responds not just to words, but to alignment. The life you were meant to live is waiting, not somewhere far off, but just beyond the walls of your own limiting beliefs. Tear them down, and the promise will meet you on the other side. When a woman begins to awaken, the first thing she feels is discomfort. The familiar patterns that once felt safe begin to feel suffocating. She senses the hollowness of her compromises, the weight of a life built around keeping others comfortable. Jung described this as the tension of opposites, the soul pulling against the ego, the true self wrestling to emerge from the false identity it had to wear for survival. This is where most turn back. The pain of transformation feels unbearable because it demands that old illusions die. The woman who once defined herself by how much she could give must now learn to receive. The woman who found identity in being needed must now accept that her worth is not measured by sacrifice. And so she clings to what is dying, fearing that without it she will have nothing left. But God never takes without giving. He strips away what cannot remain in order to make room for what must come. The Stoics understood this divine pruning. Epictetus taught that we must distinguish between what is in our control and what is not. Your thoughts, your responses, your values, these are yours to master. The opinions of others, their choices, their love or lack of it, these are not. Yet so many women chain their self-worth to things they cannot command. They hand their value over to men who have not earned it, to friends who do not honor it, to a society that profits from their doubt. But there is a deeper calling here. Every wound you have carried, every betrayal you have endured, has been forging you in silence. The nights you cried alone were not wasted. They were consecrated ground, pressing you inward toward the voice of God. For it is in the desert, not in the palace, that the soul learns to listen. And when the soul listens, the shadow begins to speak. It reveals where you have betrayed yourself, where you have settled, where you have confused attachment with love. As you face these truths, something remarkable happens. The fear of loss begins to crumble. You no longer cling to people or promises that were never yours. You stop pleading for attention because you realize you were never meant to be small. The very energy you once spent proving your value is reclaimed and redirected inward. This is not arrogance. This is alignment. And in this alignment, your relationships transform. The man who once played games no longer has power over you because you no longer respond from hunger. The friends who drained you fall away, not because you hate them, but because your spirit no longer vibrates at the frequency of lack. The opportunities that once intimidated you become clear assignments because fear no longer blinds you to your own capability. When you finally learn to sit alone without feeling empty, you have reached a holy place. Seneca wrote that a wise soul is content in itself, not because it despises others, but because it has ceased to be enslaved by them. God meets you there, in the quiet, where there is no performance, no audience, no mask. He whispers, "You were never waiting on me. I was waiting on you." Do you feel it? That subtle shift inside when you stop trying to force what was never yours. That is not weakness. That is the beginning of real power. You stop praying for God to send you someone to heal your wounds because you realize He has already given you everything to heal them yourself. You stop begging for signs because the greatest sign has always been the change rising from within you. This is how you prepare to receive the promise, not by chasing, not by striving, but by becoming. By letting the shadow be seen, by integrating every dissound piece of your soul, by saying no even when it terrifies you, and by walking away from what dishonors you without a backward glance. In that moment, heaven aligns with earth. The woman who once begged for crumbs now sits at the table of kings, not because she demanded it, but because she finally recognized she was never meant to eat from the floor. The true test comes not when life is silent, but when it tempts you with counterfeit blessings. Many women think the greatest danger is loneliness, but the deeper threat is distraction. A man appears who seems to carry everything you've prayed for, yet he carries it without depth, without the divine weight that marks something real. The promise of God cannot be imitated, but the ego is easily deceived when hunger speaks louder than discernment. This is where shadow work sharpens vision. Jung taught that what remains unconscious will appear in your life as fate. The same patterns, the same disappointments, the same betrayals. Repeating, not because you are cursed, but because you have not yet seen what they are sent to teach you. When you dare to face yourself honestly, the spell breaks. You see where you have mistaken intensity for intimacy, attention for affection, validation for love. You realize that no one can give you what you refuse to give yourself. The divine promise is never hurried. God is not a merchant offering bargains to desperate hearts. He is the master craftsman who refines you until you can hold what He entrusts. That is why He allows delays, why doors close, why people walk away. Marcus Aurelius wrote that what stands in the way becomes the way. These obstacles are not punishments. They are sacred preparations. They strip away pride, expose hidden wounds, and demand that you grow beyond the need for approval. But the ego resists. It clings to illusions, whispering that your value depends on being chosen. And yet, here is the paradox. The moment you no longer fear being overlooked, you become impossible to ignore. The woman who no longer begs, no longer bargains, no longer bends herself into unnatural shapes. She radiates a power that both intimidates and attracts. Men feel it, even if they cannot explain it. Opportunities feel it too, as though the entire universe rearranges itself to meet the energy of someone who has finally remembered who she is. Look at the women who embody this strength. They are not cold, they are clear. They love deeply, but refuse to trade their soul for affection. They forgive, yet they do not stay where love dishonors them. They walk away without slamming doors because they understand that what is not aligned with their calling cannot remain. And when they do this, they stop living as prisoners of circumstance and become co-creators of their destiny. This is individuation, the process Jung described as becoming whole, no longer living through the masks of the persona or the projections of others. You cease to be defined by roles: daughter, lover, friend, servant. You become a woman rooted in essence, not expectation. The shadow no longer controls you because you have brought it into the light. You acknowledge your anger, your fear, your desire, and rather than letting them rule you, you transform them into wisdom, boundaries, and strength. And what of God's promise? It does not arrive with trumpet blasts or sudden miracles. It unfolds quietly, almost unannounced, because by the time it comes, you have already been transformed into someone who no longer doubts she deserves it. The very thing you prayed for meets you when you no longer chase it, because you have become the version of yourself who can hold it without trembling, without compromise. There is a holy irony here. When you detach from the outcome, you draw it closer. When you stop pleading for someone to see your worth, the right people are drawn to you naturally. When you no longer fear loss, you gain what cannot be taken. This is not passivity, it is power. It is the state in which faith is no longer words, but posture, no longer hope, but embodiment. So what mindset must you shift? The belief that you are waiting on God, when in truth He is waiting on you, waiting for you to stop betraying yourself, waiting for you to stop watering dead gardens, waiting for you to choose alignment over attachment. Because when you do, the promise comes, not as a fragile answer to desperate prayers, but as the inevitable harvest of who you have become. The moment a woman stops apologizing for her strength, something sacred stirs within her. She no longer approaches life as a beggar at the gates of love, but as a queen returning to her throne. Jung would say this is when the anima, the deep feminine soul, steps out of the unconscious and takes her rightful place in consciousness. She is no longer fragmented. She is whole. But wholeness does not mean perfection. It means integration. It means that every wound has been acknowledged, every shadow embraced, every lesson absorbed, until there is no part of her she must exile to be loved. This is the profound shift of mindset, realizing that the promise of God is not something to chase outside, but something awakened inside. The divine plan does not descend from the clouds. It rises from within, revealed as she aligns with her truest self. This is why your enemies cannot block it. Why the people who left you, betrayed you, or underestimated you cannot cancel what heaven has spoken over your life. They were instruments, not obstacles. They pressed you toward the very becoming that made you ready for what is coming. Even Seneca, writing centuries before Christ, knew this truth when he said, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." The proving ground is the soul. The battle is within the mind. And the victory is subtle, but unmistakable. Fear loosens its grip, and faith becomes your native language. You no longer cling to people as lifelines because you have learned that God alone is the source. You no longer measure your worth by how others respond to you because you understand that value is inherent, not granted. Think of how powerful this makes a woman. She walks into a room and does not scan for approval. She carries her own. She no longer fears that love will abandon her because she no longer abandons herself. Men sense it immediately. Those who thrive on control feel exposed because there is nothing to manipulate in her anymore. Those who are grounded in their own wholeness feel drawn to her because they recognize her as an equal, not a servant. The Stoics spoke of a soul unshaken by fortune, neither puffed up by praise nor crushed by insult. This is divine equilibrium. It is not cold detachment, but radiant self-possession. It is the fruit of shadow work, of long nights wrestling with God, of refusing to let wounds define you. When this state of being takes root, you do not just attract blessings, you magnetize them. Life bends toward those who stand firm in truth. And yet this transformation is not loud. It does not announce itself with dramatic speeches or angry ultimatums. It moves quietly like a deep river carving stone. You stop explaining yourself to those who refuse to understand. You stop negotiating your standards with people who cannot meet them. You no longer feel compelled to prove your faith or your worth because both have become self-evident. What happens then? The promise appears not as a thunderclap, but as a dawn breaking over your life. The relationships that align with your calling simply fit. There is no struggle, no desperate effort to hold them together. The opportunities meant for you feel natural because you no longer approach them in fear. You recognize them not as random luck, but as divine timing. The woman who has shifted her mindset to receive does not grasp, does not plead, does not chase. She chooses, she discerns, she waits, but she does not wait passively. She waits as a warrior, prepared, steady, unwavering. She knows that everything that left her life made space for something greater. She knows that every no was God's protection, not his rejection. This is the fruit of alignment. You become untouchable by the chaos that once ruled you. Your peace is no longer for sale. Your worth is no longer negotiable. Your faith is no longer fragile. And when you finally stand in this power, the promise finds you. Not because you forced it, but because you became the woman capable of holding it without losing herself. The shift is complete when you can look at what you once feared to lose and feel no panic, no desperation, only calm resolve. That is the sign you are ready. Heaven's timing is perfect because heaven's work in you is complete. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.